Good afternoon. I just want to begin with a brief word of gratitude. I want to acknowledge all the unseen labor that goes into even something like a talk. Family, friends, people who take care of children, who pick up your life when you have to exit it for just a few days, mentors and colleagues who will read things for you and give you feedback. And so I'm just thankful to every person who couldn't be articulated in a footnote, including students who proofread this and give me some feedback. And I also just want to thank the amazing pre-modern critical race scholars who paved the way for the work that we're doing here today. So I'm here today because my scholarship focuses on two areas I was told I could not do. What Margot Hendricks aptly named pre-modern critical race studies and Shakespearean appropriation. There we go, okay. The former, they warned me, was too passé, a conversation long over. People cautioned that the latter would not be a strong area for a job market that, unbeknownst to them, would soon crash anyway. Naively, I did not realize I was proposing to work at the cross-section of two areas considered to be niche compared to historical archival work such as the history of science, the history of the book, the usual suspects of scholarly inquiry in the field. Since the mid-2000s, when I started graduate studies, and especially since the 2010s when I graduated, both of these subfields have become more prominent, with pre-modern critical race studies especially galvanized and authorized in recent years by institutions such as the Folger, SAA, and the Globe, to name but a few. Yet despite these advances, pre-modern critical race studies and Shakespearean appropriation studies still feel the effects of their former sidelining. Scholars may focus on one or the other, but not often on both, at least not until after tenure. The second book, right? To continue acting as if either of these areas merits limited attention affirms even tacitly that only particular subfields count as proper scholarship and that only certain subfields are related to race. By ceding this ideological ground, we risk stymieing productive intersections that emphasize rather than obscure the relationship between the pre-modern, modern, and race. As Toni Morrison, I just wanted to make sure I was on the right slide. As Toni Morrison reminds us, a criticism that needs to insist that literature is not only universal, but also race-free risks lobotomizing that literature. How do we lobotomize not only literature, but our field, when we do not place pre-modern critical race studies and appropriation studies in dialogue with one another, thereby limiting how we understand racial representation in both? Today, I provide very brief answers that I hope lead to fruitful discussion by proposing two simple premises. Appropriation studies needs pre-modern critical race studies, and pre-modern critical race studies needs appropriation studies. I turn to two Shakespearean appropriations, which I discuss in my in-process book, if you're interested, to explore these premises with you. Premise one, appropriation studies need pre-modern critical race studies. By this statement, I mean that scholarship on literary appropriation must engage with pre-modern critical race studies, as do appropriations themselves. Without the theoretical, interrogative, disruptive engagement with race modeled by pre-modern critical race studies, appropriations, the field, and the objects will fail to consider thoughtfully how the pre-modern and race speak to each other. Indeed, they will ignore the topic entirely or provide facile engagements with race that to mass audiences, usually white audiences, may look something like race work that may reify stereotypical racist thinking instead. The Q Brothers' adaptation, Othello the Remix, exemplifies precisely this approach to race, demonstrating how crucially appropriations need pre-modern critical race studies. The 90-minute production debuted as a U.S. entry in the Globe to Globe Festival and subsequently ran twice at the Chicago Shakespeare Theater and again off-Broadway. The production's second song exposes the Q Brothers' anxiety over audience reception regarding their hip-hop Shakespearean retelling when they rap. Now, I know what you're thinking. Hold on just a minute. That's a tragedy, yep, but there's comedy in it. Clearly, the Q Brothers conceived of themselves responding to traditional theatergoers disinclined to their project. because they use low-status, Black-associated hip-hop to explore high-status, white-associated Shakespeare. As a result, brothers Jeffrey and Gregory Quaim deploy a toothsome version of hip-hop that reflects its appropriation by the white-run music industry. This decision creates a colorblind approach to both hip-hop and race by stripping away the exploration of race inherent in Othello and hip-hop. By referencing colorblindness here, I expand upon scholarly considerations of Shakespeare colorblind casting. I use colorblind instead to mean the creation of a racial narrative that manifests a blindness toward color, specifically, in this case, Blackness, as anything more than a mere symbol of identity instead of a crucial factor motivating and reinforcing systemic injustices. Sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva identifies colorblind racism as a new racism that replaced the kind seen in the Jim Crow era. Instead of arguing for Black people's biological and moral inferiority, whites now rationalize minorities' contemporary status as a product of market dynamics, naturally occurring phenomena, and Blacks' imputed cultural limitations. Especially salient for a discussion of Othello the Remix is the way that hip-hop becomes affected by colorblind borrowing that mirrors America's broader racial dynamics. Jason Rodriguez notes how the type of colorblind ideology outlined above affects white youth's interactions with hip-hop. Because they disconnect racial identity from their cultural consumption, they take, quote, the racially coded meanings out of hip-hop and replace them with colorblind ones for their own purposes, end quote. This white consumption of hip-hop, stripped of its racial elements, reflects the genre's history. Scholars agree that the history of hip-hop has been influenced and altered by the desire for a colorblind form of the genre. M.K. Asante Jr. recounts hip-hop's political beginnings, explaining, although West African in its derivation, hip-hop emerged in the Bronx in the mid-70s as a form of aesthetic and socio-political rebellion against the flames of systemic oppression. As hip-hop artists sought commercially viable careers with the major record companies in the late 1980s and early 90s, however, they experienced, quote, censorship through intimidation, budget cutting, refusing to advertise or allow airtime, and via other legal channels, which resulted in a restriction of the socio-political voices of commercially viable artists, end quote. Consequently, as Trisha Rose explains, party, political, Afrocentric, and avant-garde forms of rap were driven out of the corporate-promoted mainstream. Hip-hop's history thus reveals the erasure of the, quote, link between Black music and the politics of Black life, end quote, leaving in its stead a version of the genre often critiqued for its emphasis on materialism, sexism, homophobia, and racial caricatures, but enthusiastically consumed by white youth culture because of these very qualities. The Q brothers craft an appropriation of Othello that reflects this colorblind engagement with hip-hop. According to Othello the Remix's character description, Othello has escaped the pitfalls of the ghetto he was raised in, with ghetto here functioning as coded language for the Black inner city. This socially mobile rap persona fits within the personal narratives articulated by real-life MCs, including the Notorious B.I.G., 50 Cent, and the rappers directly inspiring the Remix's Othello, Jay-Z, and The Game. In the song, Never Comin' Down, Othello explores the familiar hard knock life. He explains, I never knew my pop's mom's was a junkie, then asserts that he was raised in the streets as a child of the ghetto filled with people smoking rocks. On these streets, either you slang crack or you got a wicked jump shot. This depiction inhabits the tense space of many hip-hop personas. On the one hand, inviting a gritty exploration of socioeconomically marginalized African-American voices, on the other, invoking American stereotypes about Black communities and the families within them. Yet most rappers, especially male rappers, create an entire oeuvre in which to craft a counter-narrative that contextualizes their seemingly stereotypical backgrounds. Indeed, Imani Perry contends that rappers often adopt thug mimicry, embodying American stereotypes of Black masculinity. But they do so to indict white supremacy by critiquing the sociological conditions, poverty, police brutality, and joblessness that contributed to his or her becoming this person. Unfortunately, in Othello the Remix, Othello does not provide the sociologically informed alternative interrogation of his drug-addled upbringing. For example, when Othello asks, who can I trust now? His crew and he respond, more money, more problems, quoting the title of the Notorious B.I.G.'s 1997 posthumous hit single, More Money, More Problems, which celebrates the materialism of hip-hop success while noting its pitfalls. Deploying this highly recognizable song as an intertext for Othello the Remix exposes how the Q brothers overlook racial inequity. For instance, instead, they could have referenced Biggie Smalls' Things Done Changed from 1994, which narrates how back in the day, neighborhoods were characterized by lounging at the barbecues, drinking brews with the neighborhood crews. But turn your pages to 1993, ends us getting smoked, gee, believe me, talk slick, you get your neck slit quick. Indeed, here, Biggie makes an assertion similar to Othello when he relates, if I wasn't in the rap game, I'd probably have a key knee deep in the crack game. The distinction is that Biggie provides an alternative picture of Black neighborhoods involving community, celebrated by cookouts and sitting on the porch during a summer day. This positive view of Black society never appears in Othello the Remix. Thus, quoting "more money, more problems" becomes one of many decisions the Q brothers make that sideline race by ignoring the racial legacy informing the ghetto, constructing their shaping of Othello. Perhaps nowhere is the Q brothers' colorblind engagement with race clearer, however, than in Brabantio's confrontation of Othello after the elopement. Brabantio's tirade against Othello climaxes with his assertion, "You're so small, he's so much bigger, I just don't see you with that." In addressing the Black Othello's overpowering size in comparison to the white Desdemona, Brabantio invokes the trope of the Black male rapist while stopping one step shy of using virulent racist language. Clearly, the unspoken N-word hangs over the theater. In the pause, the racist discourse otherwise omitted in the production exists as an absent presence. This powerful artistic decision makes the audience complicit in Brabantio's racist musings by filling in the discursive gaps. Yet the Q brothers diffuse the tension by having Brabantio whine in reply, "I was gonna say rapper, you didn't let me finish." And he says it almost just like that, a line that in all performances I viewed elicited audience laughter. Indeed, the collective's response to Brabantio makes the desire to evacuate the moment of racist characterization clear when they rap. He turned his back on her, but not out of hatred. He was stuck in the ways of a different generation. The Q brothers' discomfort with and reluctance to engage with racism comes through in this explicit disavowal of it, one strategically covered up by comedy. The Q brothers' racial colorblindness then comes at a cost, both by limiting the thematic resonances in their reinterpretation of Othello and by circumscribing the power of the generic form they choose to deliver their retelling. Othello the Remix illustrates the need for appropriations of pre-modern work to engage with pre-modern critical race studies. For the Q brothers, it would have shed light on Othello's status as an alienated Moor in Renaissance Venice, a status of shifting inclusion and swift exclusion that would map well onto the use of hip-hop MCs by white corporate America. They would also have been provided with the ideological tools to craft a production not anti-Black in its stereotypical depictions. And appropriation scholars likewise need pre-modern critical race studies, for it is all too easy to get swept up in the fun of the Q brothers' 4/4 beat, their irreverence toward the bard, their attempt to try something energetic and new, that to a casual observer may seem to engage with systemic racial inequalities in ways that echo the hip-hop we listen to day to day. If appropriators want to do race work better in their reimaginings, if they truly want to remix and not reinscribe, and if appropriation scholars truly want to see race in appropriations, it is clear the creators and scholars of appropriations alike need pre-modern critical race studies. Premise 2, pre-modern critical race studies needs appropriation studies. Recently, on NPR's Code Switch, Ayanna Thompson identified The Merchant of Venice, Othello, and The Taming of the Shrew as 3 toxic plays that resist rehabilitation and appropriation. She contends that when Shakespeare and his plays are not seen as always necessarily good for us, then we will be in a position where we can maybe rewrite the endings, change the plays. Thompson's call to rewrite endings and change narratives is what appropriation studies offers pre-modern race. Christy Desmond and Suyata Iyengar deftly note the complex history shaping the term appropriation. They identify 2 recent voices who build upon appropriation's history as a political interpersonal reimagining to articulate its current signification. Thomas Cartelli's assertion that appropriations generally work for the interests of the appropriator and against the interests of the work or author being appropriated, and Julie Sanders, who defines appropriation as having a greater distance from the so-called source than do adaptations. This emphasis on the interest of the appropriator and distance from the source allows for a destabilization of pre-modern narratives by providing radical reimaginings instead. Jordan Peele's film Get Out is precisely this type of reimagining. As numerous reviewers note, as Carol Mejia-Laperle will discuss this April at SAA, and as Arthur Little observed in a seminar a few years ago, Get Out is Othello. I would add, importantly, an appropriation of it. When put in conversation with Othello, Get Out's concept of the coagula exemplifies the narrative revisions appropriations make possible for pre-modern stories. Get Out literalizes the horror of Othello's racial experience by stressing white supremacy's physical and psychological appropriation of and violence against Black bodies. Get Out follows African-American Chris, who joins his white girlfriend Rose for a weekend to visit her family for the first time, a family he learns unaware that he is Black. Rose assures Chris of her family's liberal anti-racist bona fides, yet Chris feels unease as he meets Walter and Georgina, the friendly if odd Black help. The film reveals that the Armitages have chosen Chris as their next victim for a process and product they invented called the coagula, a white brain surgically implanted into a Black body so that an aging or physically impaired white person can live on. However, a piece of the former brain and thus Black self remains, which necessitates the sunken place, the psychological corner reserved for the hypnotized, appropriated Black identity, where the victim sees what occurs but cannot respond. Chris miraculously escapes, killing the family in the process and nearly strangling Rose to death minutes before his friend Rod rescues him. Through the concept of the coagula, Get Out viscerally confronts modern society's violent appropriation of Black bodies. Recognizing this appropriation can help one reconsider Othello's service to the Venetian state and his tragic end. Ta-Nehisi Coates addresses precisely this appropriative violence, arguing that the elevation of whiteness comes through the pillaging of life, liberty, labor, and land, through the flaying of backs, the chaining of limbs, the strangling of dissidents, the destruction of families, the rape of mothers, the sale of children, and various other acts meant first and foremost to deny you and me the right to secure and govern our own bodies. This violence functions as the Armitage's modus operandi as they seek to create more coagula, which I will address by focusing on Georgina. Georgina, actually Rose's grandmother, reminds viewers of the physical devastation enacted on Black bodies by white supremacy. One truly sees the appropriation of the Black body when Chris finds a picture of Georgina's unnamed host. Her scar, her formal hair, and her elderly attire all contrast with the selfie, which shows her with a millennial pout, luscious natural curls, and contemporary clothes. Also particularly notable is her ultimate destruction. As Chris flees the Armitage's house, he crashes his car into her. Chris's subsequent attempt to save her suggests that to him, Georgina is not the white brain inside, but rather the Black woman signaled by her physical appearance. Chris thus sees hope for Black subjectivity despite its appropriation by whiteness. His recognition of her Black selfhood juxtaposes with Rose, who exits the house declaring "Grandma," indicating that for her, the white interior supersedes the woman's Black exterior. The camera returns to the car, where Georgina's wig slides off, thereby emphasizing the surgical scar marring her forehead. She revives, grabbing Chris and screaming, "You ruined my house!" Despite Chris's attempt, the eradication of the Black self who once inhabited the woman next to him is complete. Through Georgina, the film comments on the ramifications of white domination over Black bodies. Once part of the coagula, Black selfhood becomes unrecoverable. This is a logical extreme of the violence Coates argues permeates the treatment of Black bodies in America. As a broader framework, then, the coagula makes all viewers, those already cognizant and those woefully not so, hyper-aware of the constant physical and metaphysical threat whiteness poses to Blackness. In addition to stressing the corporeal and mental ramifications of the white appropriation of Black bodies, the coagula also demonstrates the white brain's overpowering nature, a literalization of the way that a white view of the world strives to govern Black experience. Sociologist Joe R. Fegan calls this the white racial frame, the white worldview, quote, dominant through the country and indeed in much of the Western world that crafts a strong positive orientation to whites and whiteness and a strong negative orientation to racial others who are exploited and oppressed, end quote. A confrontation between Chris and Georgina powerfully communicates this white domination. In the midst of the Armitage's party, Chris tells Georgina, "All I know is sometimes if there's too many white people, I get nervous, you know?" In this moment, Georgina's true self struggles to appear, as indicated by the fact that her smile falls as she trembles and cries, never taking her eyes off Chris. But the white Georgina's brain overcomes this temporary lapse, as signaled by the return of the oversized grin And she responds, no, 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 10 times. That's not my experience, not at all. Upon first viewing, the repeated no's seem meant for Chris, but considered in light of the film's big reveal, these no's may also serve as a command of repression for the young woman whose body hosts Georgina's white mind. White control over the black self may lapse for a moment in the coagula, but the dynamic here makes it clear that in the coagula, the white brain demands totalizing authority, thus embodying white supremacy's sociological dynamics. As an indicator of the physical, mental, and sociological effects of white supremacy upon black selfhood, Peele's depiction of the coagula provides a version of Othello's narrative that bolsters pre-modern critical race readings focusing on Othello's role as a black man navigating the white-dominated Venetian society. Indeed, placing Othello and Get Out in conversation with each other, especially if one sees the latter of an appropriation of the former, invites what Peter Erickson and Kim F. Hall identify as cross-historical tracing that might foster reflection upon strategies for othering in the early modern period that resonate with those deployed in modernity. Like Georgina, Othello too is deployed in the service of whiteness. Umbrine Databoy stresses the dominating nature of his service, arguing that Othello's commitment to Venice's imperial war signals an obligation to the state that exceeds volunteer or even paid mercenary service. Venice, it seems, can and does deploy him with impunity. Indeed, Brabantio's unstaged hospitality demonstrates the self-serving nature of Venetian's engagement with Othello, for Brabantio's welcome of him and his exotic tales finds its limits when the threat of miscegenation looms. Not only does Othello work for a coterie of all-white Venetians who order him at will, but as a Christianized Moor opposing the Turks, he also champions Christianity and its function as a force at once civilizing for the converted, yet exclusionary against the unconverted, and above all, a white force. As Dennis Britton explains, Ethiopians, Moors, Turks, and Jews were recognized in the early modern period as figures of alterity foreign to normative white Christianity. In his role as a soldier, Othello therefore defends not just Venice nor Christianity, but whiteness as well. Thus, in civil and interpersonal contexts, Othello, like Get Out's Georgina, serves whiteness in a literal and ideological sense. Indeed, one could interpret Othello as a black man whose brain, like Georgina's, has figuratively undergone the coagular process of whitening his identity, only to grapple with the ramifications in his final moments. Databoy reads Othello in this way, arguing that the duality of Othello's visage points to a psychological fairness belied by his somatic one. Britton, too, stresses how Venetian imperial interests necessitate an Othello who is far more fair than black. Othello thus mirrors those who have undergone the coagular process as a white mind within a black body. As the film makes clear, the coagula ultimately entails a marginalization of black selfhood. This is precisely Othello's journey in the play, so much so that he disavows his own name. That's he that was Othello, here I am, becoming, like Georgina's host, an unnamed entity traumatized by whiteness. By highlighting the violent physical and ideological appropriation of black bodies and minds by whiteness, Get Out reorients how scholars, educators, students, directors, actors, and myriad future adapters alike might perceive of and therefore represent race's role in Othello's tragic downfall. For reimagined through the racial dynamics highlighted by Get Out, Othello's racial tragedy is the annihilation of black selfhood at the hands of a white society that destroys black subjectivity. This interpretation follows the shift Hendricks called for at the last Race Before Race, recognizing the anti-blackness in Othello while transforming the narrative into an anti-white one that indicts white supremacy. Get Out thus demonstrates how appropriating pre-modern narratives allows us to move beyond reifying whiteness through signifiers such as Shakespeare or terms like Anglo-Saxon to crafting radical narratives that decenter whiteness instead. To return to the two premises guiding this talk, premise one, appropriations need pre-modern critical race studies. How else to explain limited appropriation scholarship addressing race in what David Sterling Brown calls Shakespeare's other race plays, such as the overwhelmingly white cast history plays? Indeed, all pre-modern and frankly even modern appropriations would benefit from pre-modern critical race studies. In fact, any critical race theory. It's true. We live in a world where many are comfortable with a fantasy show depicting dragons, but in which representing a powerful, non-stereotypical, non-exoticized person of color is a step too far, supposedly ahistorical. Indeed, let us call for race theory to be applied to all narratives imagined on the page, podcast stage, and across various screens. Premise 2, pre-modern critical race studies need appropriation studies. The phenomenal scholarship undertaken by so many scholars in this room leaves no doubt that revisiting the archives is a vital endeavor. But for many of our students, and let's admit even some of our colleagues, but also especially undergraduates, the archives are inaccessible, even exclusionary. Students' archives are what we provide in our classrooms. Thug notes, Shakespeare memes, film adaptations, a graphic novel, Kill Shakespeare, clips from Doctor Who, as well as the media all around them that relentlessly references Shakespeare and the pre-modern more broadly. This begs questions such as, do they understand the terms adaptation and appropriation just as much as they might archival ones, such as verso and recto? More specifically, have we encouraged them to talk about the pre-modern in race in ways that they can transfer to other contexts? Have we taught them to observe what is present but also absent in regards to race as old narratives continue to be retold? Even as we encourage our students to revisit and rethink historical archives, we must train them to assess and create what will become the future's archives. In the powerful play American More, Keith Hamilton Cobb, the protagonist, the actor, who's unnamed, discusses how his blackness forces teachers, directors, and audiences alike to question their assumptions about who may perform Shakespeare and how. He notes that when embodying adamance as a black man, the listener all too often has no place for it, no tools with which to hear it. Are we providing our students and each other the best possible interpretive tools? Geraldine Hang observed at the last Race Before Race that tools allow you to acknowledge, quote, racial phenomena, racial institutions, and racial practices, end quote, while Hendricks cautioned that the master's tools are ineffective. Are we using all possible tools for identifying and analyzing racial representation, or the master's ineffective ones? I contend that it is only when we offer the tools for both pre-modern critical race studies and appropriation studies that we can truly assert that we are using everything at our disposal. There's a reason these subfields have been marginalized in the past, for each has the potential to center often silenced voices, to radically challenge the status quo, to call for ethics and equity in spaces where people have long ignored imbalances of power. How much more influential and effective could they be if they dialogued more with each other? As Mahia Leprol asked at the end of her talk last time, as we commit to anti-racist efforts in our research and teaching, what materials, archives, histories, and experiences can be put beside each other? At least one answer is pre-modern critical race studies and appropriation studies. So I leave you today with questions about how to bring these two fields together so that we have the tools to resist lobotomized literary studies, resist lobotomized pedagogy, resist lobotomized narratives that so many still try to maintain race-free. Thank you. So I have some questions here. I know we were supposed to have 3, and I snuck in some sub-questions into long sentences, but I'm also happy for other questions that you might have.
I'm Barine Dadaboy. Vanessa, thank you so much for this fabulous talk. I have, I guess, a question that's related to what you're asking here. I haven't seen the Q Brothers, but what I know from you and other scholars, there are certain people who are very admiring of this, and it gets a lot of, they get a lot of institutional play. But I don't understand how people can see this and not think about it as minstrelsy. Do you see it as being that?
That's a great question, and I actually think that it's easy. Listen, the first time I went and saw this in the archives, I was just trying to figure out, my students had all told me, oh, you need to go see this, you need to go see this, and I hadn't had a chance to see it in performance, so I actually watched it in the archives. And here's one thing that I realized watching in the archives: when you're doing that, you can review. Right? Whereas when you're going to a performance, unless you're going to pay to go see it again, it's just a one-off. And so you're just kind of trying to figure out, like, what's going on, and what are these lyrics, and what's happening, and how is this Othello? And so I think it's really easy to miss some of these details. The details were heightened for me when I purchased the script, which some people didn't have. So I was really lucky that when I was working on the chapter, the script just came out. So I think that all helps because it's super easy to be distracted. right, it's charming, and the beats all around, and it's like so different, especially if you're used to going to the Chicago Shakespeare Theater. It's really different from what you'll typically see there, and I'm just gonna leave it at that. And so I can see how people are enamored with this, with Othello the remix. But I do think so that's kind of, I'm not trying to give people an out, but I can also see how they can kind of, all the flashiness can kind of intervene with the kind of critical thinking that we are required to do. And so when you ask about minstrelsy, yes, it's really, why did they choose to do a tragedy and then insist that it has to be comedic? And this was their first tragedy. So subsequently they've done Romeo and Juliet, which I haven't had a chance to see, so don't ask me because I don't know, I can't answer. But like, why did they choose to do a tragedy and then add all these comedic elements? Because these aren't the only ones. So in a longer version of this, for example, they make fun of Othello very explicitly for using ax instead of ask. And when you see that, I just don't understand how this isn't some sort of something akin to, a minstrel show. In fact, Doug Lanier takes them to task in his article in Borrowers and Lenders, and he's not talking about Othello the Remix. He's talking about their version of the Comedy of Errors, which I think was entitled The Bombity of Errors, and he, in fact, calls them a modern-day minstrel show. I think, like I said, people can get enamored with the fact that this sounds and looks so different than what you might see in traditional theater. But so I would say, I'm not trying to give people the benefit of the doubt, just that I can see how it's easy to turn that part off. You just want to have fun for 90 minutes, and I don't want to think this hard about it. But it's hard not to see it once you start looking at the details.
So I'm going to show a bit of my cards in regards to this. You already know. I am of the belief that because particularly Othello is a construction of white people's ideas of black people, and we have in our modern sort of performances real black bodies taking on that role that was constructed quite literally by a white man for a white audience. Do you believe that we run the risk of confirming a lot of these negative racial stereotypes?
Yes, I don't even have to stop and think about that. Is there a
Okay.
second half? Okay, so yes.
So in terms of that, with that in mind, do you believe that the more effective way in order for students and your peers, not saying that this should be exclusively done, but do you think that we could benefit from seeing, quote unquote, traditional performances of, the more, but a black-faced version of it? And that way people are able to understand just what is like occurring, particularly with Shakespeare. I think that what tends to happen when we do see modern performances and we see, authentic black people taking on a black role, a lot of this stuff is obfuscated from us.
I think that's an excellent question. I don't trust if you're going to have, so then that raises a question. So it's not to give you an answer, but then who, so if you're going back to say original performance practices, right? Which I know that we know some of them, but not all of them. And so let's say you're going to original performance practices. So then who's playing Othello? So a white man? So I'm not sure I trust white men to take care of that role either. Right? I mean, I'm not, we know how damaging minstrel shows were, and there is no reason to sorry, white men, there is no reason to trust that somehow white men are going to be responsible with this role that is so problematic. And it's not spinach. I agree with Ayana, right? And so I'm not really sure. I think to some degree it gets to the artifice and the construction of identity for sure, right? So you can't ignore Ian Smith's discussion and others, but like how he talks about the minute you start showing the artifice, it makes you aware of the white construction of Othello's identity, for sure. But then I'm not sure the answer is to have white men embody the role. And so I don't know, I think that in some ways, so I heard a talk by Ayanna Thompson. I'm gonna keep referencing you. So I heard a talk where she was talking about a performance. Was it in Berlin? Yeah, where it's like the role of Othello kind of shifts between the actors, and then it's like in a gorilla suit, and then also some costuming changes. And so I think that that also can get to the idea of artifice and construction without necessarily going back to what have been problematic performance practices from the past. Sorry.
I was just going to respond to that. I mean, I think that if you take race, but then you add an intersectional element, such as gender, then that becomes highly problematic, because then that would mean that every male-authored female character could then not be performed by a woman. And when you take a step back and you think about how many female roles have been written by men, that means that women would virtually have a very minuscule space within theater and within other aspects of literature. So I mean, I think there are other ways of really kind of thinking about this constructually, of who's being represented and how they're being represented.
Mine was, thank you for that wonderful and energetic talk. Mine was just a follow-up comment about Jonathan's point about whether you would play him in blackface. And I was just going to reference, I don't know if you know, the movie Spike Lee's 2000 film, Bamboozled. But it would be a great reference point to check out, because in that film, if I'm recalling it correctly, the star character decides to basically have the minstrelsy exposed, and it completely backfires, and everyone's like, oh, minstrelsy's back. And he's shocked that it actually leads to the return of minstrelsy and the sort of reinforcing of it as kind of cultural, what have you. So there are warnings.
Right.
That was it.
I had a question in terms of pedagogy, in wondering how to sort of teach a class in balancing traditional uses of Shakespeare's plays, revisions of Shakespeare's plays, and questions of some people have suggested just completely revising the curriculum and moving towards revising essentially the canon.
Well, I think that it probably takes all those things, right? So you can revise the canon and also think about the most ethical ways to revisit the stories that we continue to come back to over and over again. So if we're going to continue to have students watch and read Othello, what do we do with that? And so one of the things, I'll just tell you what I do to kind of balance these. The first time I taught a Shakespeare and race course, so I teach at a smaller institution. I don't get to teach my courses as often, my Shakespeare courses as often as I want. So I get super excited when I get to teach them. And the first time I taught Shakespeare and race, it was strictly historical, and we used archival materials, and we looked at a whole bunch of, and it wasn't just, it was like Shakespeare in conversation with a bunch of other of his contemporary authors, right? And then I had asked the students to think about the question of how race in the early modern period dovetails or not with race today, and they just couldn't get there because I hadn't given them the tools to do it. Right? So I asked them to do it, but then like all their papers were historical archival papers, and that's fine, but it's because I hadn't modeled for them how to engage with the contemporary. So then the second time I taught the course, I did something different. So I reduced the number of primary texts that we were reading, and we still did the archival historical material, but then we also watched an adaptation of each of the plays that we were engaging with, and then in addition to that, we read a novella or some sort of written adaptation of the work as well. So for example, and I'm not saying that I would do this again, but for example, so we read The Merchant of Venice, and then we watched a Trevor Nunn's version of it, and then we also read Shylock Is My Name. And I think that by doing that, It helps students be able to make those cross-historical connections because I modeled it for them, and it changed the canon. I mean, it doesn't really change the canon because, like, so Shylock is my name is Hogarth, and there's a whole bunch of problems with that, but it gives them more text. So let me give a better one. With the Tempest, we read Prospero's Daughter, and that was really interesting because it was a great way. I think that text is especially intersectional when it's thinking about gender and race and colonialism in a retelling of the Tempest. And so I think that that's a way that you can do multiple things. But you know what? I work at an institution where I don't have to get my classes approved, and where I can pretty much do whatever I want because I'm not at an R1. And so I don't have someone kind of looking over my shoulder telling me what has to happen in every class. I'm not saying that that's your experience, but I know a very, very fancy scholar we all love who had to get one of her courses approved. And so I have the ability to do that, and I'm not sure if you all do, but if you do, it's so productive for the students. And I will just say one last thing. I feel like I'm just talking so much. I will say one last thing, that one of the things I did was I started with theory. So I had them listen to the scholarship of membership, the color of membership, the SAA plenary from a few years ago, and then I had them read the entire Shakespeare Quarterly on Shakespeare and race, and they were really mad at me because that's how we started the term, and they were so tired. But then they were like, oh, we know why you did this, because one, it made them feel like they were part of a conversation, and they're not doctoral students, they're undergraduate and MA students, but they felt like they were part of the conversation. And two, it gave them the vocabulary and the resources and the frameworks for them to enter the text. And some of them were sophomores, and I made them do it anyway, and they will do it. You just have to tell them why and that it matters, and they will come along with you. So that's what I think has proven especially productive for me in the classroom.
So this is about, I think, the really productive way that you put together pre-modern critical race studies and this very specific definition of appropriation studies that thinks about race and power and minstrelsy and blackface and all these sorts of other issues. I wonder if is there something going on in Shakespeare studies where I don't even think medieval studies has really thought through this, because I think there's like one article about medieval drama and blackface in the entire scholarship, because they haven't had that conversation yet. But in a similar way to medieval studies and thinking about medieval drama, where the stuff was produced and performed for centuries, and then eventually it sort of randomly got, it got written down finally, somehow, some way, and that's what's used. And I know for the sort of, we fetishize the first folio in certain ways, right? But the fact that these are kind of snapshots of performances that we don't know why are we fetishizing this kind of faithful to what original, if that makes sense. This sort of weird, almost genealogical something.
Yeah, I think that that's actually a really important, so, because there's only so much time, but I actually think that's a really important conversation that adaptation and appropriation studies do have, right? Trying to disrupt what is the idea of the source? Was the source ever stable in the first place? And so the answer for many people is no. And there was a time where the question was, oh, here we have the source, right? It's fidelity studies, like here we have the source, and like how has this changed? And so a lot of scholars, Christy Desmet, Doug Lanier, Sujato Iyengar, Alexa Jubin, MJ Kidney, so many different scholars have been trying to think about like what are different ways of coming at the source, right? How do you even determine what that source is? And so I think that's really helpful. But I think what needs to happen, and it has, so I don't want to say it hasn't happened at all, but I would love to just see more is, yes, the interest in the source is really important, but we also need to be thinking about what's produced. So the adaptation or appropriation itself, and what work is it doing? Because we've been thinking so much about, okay, what does the source work do, and how does it define the adaptation or the appropriation? And then also, how does the adaptation and appropriation then create what we imagine as the source? And that's really productive. But I also think that part of the next step is like, great. So if, by and large, we're away from fidelity, and I'm saying by and large because, of course, right, there's always someone, but by and large, we've moved away from fidelity, then what's next? And I hope that what's next is more careful engagement with critical race theory, because some people do work with race, but it's often descriptive, and that critical race theory will help think about what is this doing with audiences, with students, with people who are receiving it? Because like I said, this is our future archive, right? This is what people are gonna be like, what were people saying about race in 2019? And they're gonna look at something like Get Out, but then also, something else like, what was it, Green Book or whatever, right? So I think that I'm hoping that the conversation takes that next step and continues that dialogue more consistently than it has.
All right, and I think that takes us to time, so another huge round of applause.